first of all, thanks everybody for coming. And a huge thanks to Mary. There's nowhere else I would have ever wanted to have my book launch event than here. And I feel really lucky that I could be here. And thank you for your really kind words too. I'm going to read just a little bit, and then so for those of you who know me from Four Stories, which is a literary series I used to run, you'll know that I never do anything unless there's like wine involved, which is over there, and also bubbly water, and also like a little trivia thing with a free prize at the end. So so in Four Stories it was a free drink, but because all the drinks are free tonight, I will explain the little trivia thing after. But the prize will be, I will buy a copy of your book from here for a book tonight for you. So, I want to do that one because of Four Stories, but also because I know it's a kind of difficult time to be in the world right now, in this country and in many countries, and also this is a difficult history. So I wanted to be able to acknowledge the kind of sadness and fear around that, and also still have a free prize. Anyway, okay. So the dedication to Ellie, my inspiration, right here. Chapter 1, Forced, March 30th, 1942. Just past dawn on March 30th, 1942, Elaine Buckman-Yoneda stood on a Los Angeles sidewalk, unsure where to turn. She looked up at the building before her, solid concrete and stretching half a block, the South Spring Street Civil Control Station, where she'd been ordered to bring her 3-year-old son, Tommy, for deportation to a concentration camp. In the early morning light, a cool wind strafed her cheek and rustled her brown curls. She hesitated for a moment, then straightened in resolve. Reaching under 5 feet, Elaine was known to stand tall in the face of adversity, rising as if she could launch past such minor constraints as nature, as if she'd tower over anything in her way. She paid no heed to biology's limits. Elaine would stare down anyone who tried to take her son. Keeping Tommy by her side, she surveyed the crowd of people already waiting. One long line snaking down South Spring Street. Overhead, trolley cables hung in the air, taut black wires against a pale sky. The streetcars would be getting even more use soon, as rubber rations made new tires scarce. Essentials would continue to dwindle now that Japan had bombed Pearl Harbor and the country was at war. Many in line that morning wore their Sunday best, despite the new deprivations of wartime. They may have been Japanese, but almost all were American, too. Some were likely U.S. veterans, Elaine knew, having served their country faithfully. Not even that would matter now. Before answering the order to appear that morning, men had donned ties and bowler hats, women pressed dresses and starched collars. Girls had forced their straight black hair into neat waves. Most stood quietly as they peered through the early light, some with heads craned forward, as if they might catch a glimpse of their fate. Elaine was the only white person among them. Looking down, she watched the breeze disturb Tommy's dark ringlets, their hue from her husband, their texture from her. The child breathed in and out, cold air filling his torso, each breath like a gift from the grip of his asthmatic chest. Elaine had spent much of his short life in and out of hospitals with him. Too much dust, too strenuous an exertion, could leave him gasping, liable to drown in the liquid of his lungs. But Elaine refused to give in to fear. She would do whatever necessary to protect him. For it was him the army wanted, she'd been told over the phone by a priest the night before. Not you, the priest had explained. Not if you're white, he meant, even though she'd given birth to a half-Japanese child. The clergyman was from the Maryknoll Mission, a Roman Catholic order that had long worked with the Japanese American community. was now assisting with their removal from the West Coast. Foreign or citizen, healthy or sick, loyal or lost, all had to go. But as for Elaine, "Oh, you don't have to go, you don't have to go," he'd said the previous evening as she'd clutched the handset in her parents' apartment, the darkness shrouding their home in the Jewish enclave of Boyle Heights. "Nor will you be allowed to," he'd suggested. Elaine had stared, stupefied, into the air. She was trying, with little success, to absorb this frocked man's nonsense. That day, March 29th, 1942, Civil Exclusion Order Number 3 had been issued. 2,000 people of Japanese descent living around Elaine were to appear for processing by 8 o'clock the next morning at the 707 South Spring Street Civil Control Station in preparation for transport 220 miles inland to a dusty plain called Manzanar at the foot of the Sierra Nevada. In no more than 3 days, by April 2nd, at noon sharp, not a soul among them should be left. Elaine had heard the announcement herself over the radio that evening. It had been addressed to all persons of Japanese ancestry, both aliens and non-aliens. It conveyed an order directly from the Western Defense Command and 4th Army of the United States, with a time and place for those in the vicinity of Los Angeles to report the next day for, quote, registration. According to the U.S. Army, her son Tommy, like anyone along the West Coast with even, quote, the slightest amount of Japanese blood, was to be rounded up, evacuated, they called it, and sent to a camp. Hearing the announcement, Elaine had been frantic. Surely they wouldn't try to take a 3-year-old, half-Japanese child. She'd called the nearest army station. She'd called the Marinelle Mission. The only answer she could get was that she needed to appear the next morning with Tommy, or she'd be in violation of the Army's order. According to federal law, she'd also be subject to a fine of $5,000, imprisonment, or both. Now on the sidewalk, with a rising sun throwing shadows across the pavement, Elaine saw a soldier and a priest run towards her. Not here, she heard one of them shouting. The men surrounded Elaine and Tommy, then hurried them toward the building, the former Security First National Bank. Etched columns still flanked the entrance, fluted pillars 3 stories high, stretching towards the cold expanse of sky. Elaine knew immediately why these men had balked at her presence in a line not meant for whites. Their haste failed to surprise. She had spent years leading labor demonstrations, protesting California's racist and repressive policies, being menaced by Red Squad batons. She'd even been jailed, bruised by brass knuckles. She defied the state's anti-miscegenation laws by marrying a Japanese-American man, a fellow activist, so she would not be cowed by this priest or soldier before her now. The men ushered Elaine and Tommy inside, the priest again insisting that it was her son they wanted, not her. As if they were just going to roll out the red carpet for her, she thought, and then expect her to hand over her son. If these men thought she was just going to surrender her child, well then, they really knew from nothing. 3 months and 23 days earlier, with Japan's bombing of Pearl Harbor, more than 2,000 Americans had been killed. Since then, Elaine, her husband Carl, and their children had mostly stayed inside, avoiding the stares of strangers and the barrage of disturbing headlines. Jap beast and his plot to rape the world, read a 1942 magazine cover with a white woman pinned beneath a Japanese soldier's rifle. Some newspapers couldn't even bring themselves to print the term Japanese American. Hyphenated Japs face thorough investigation, reported the January 19th paper, front page of the Wilmington Daily Press Journal, the local paper on the waterfront where Carl worked as a longshoreman before he was fired that winter for having Japanese ancestors. On February 2nd, a Los Angeles Times editorial went further. A viper is nonetheless a viper, wherever the egg is hatched. So a Japanese American, born of Japanese parents, grows up to be a Japanese, not an American. 2 weeks later, on February 19, 1942, President Franklin Roosevelt signed Executive Order 9066, officially enabling the forced removal of anyone deemed a threat from the entire West Coast. Newsstands throughout the city placed the Los Angeles Times front and center. U.S. acts to end Jap peril here. The implication was clear. Even citizens of Japanese descent were now nothing more than Japs, or danger. With the inevitability of being banished, and with rampant rumors of violence against Japanese across the western states, Elaine's husband Carl had departed Los Angeles on March 23rd. He'd taken one of the very first transports to the Manzanar concentration camp, officially called Owens Valley Reception Center, in a desiccated plain near Death Valley. He'd volunteered to be among the first to go and build housing for those who would be sent after. Perhaps, he thought, he could improve conditions somehow, or help guarantee the safety and well-being of his community, now that all efforts to halt the forced removal had failed. He was sure that eventually they would all be taken. The early Manzanar volunteers had been promised union wages, and without a job or a source of income, Carl needed the work. To seal the deal, he'd been promised that the families of volunteers would be the last to be imprisoned. He'd still doubted that his wife and son would have to go anyway, because Elaine was white, and who would take a 3-year-old half-Japanese child? Thank you. We have some time for questions, and then, okay, I'm getting shaking head,
for sure.
that's right, or the nodding head.
Yeah.
So we have some time for questions if anyone has any, then I'd be happy to answer, and then we can do our little free book thing, and then I can sign books. So, yes.
Are there other known documented cases of families being broken up in which they were non-Japanese, like spouses of other people that were non-Japanese people? Okay.
Yeah, that's a great question, and actually the book goes into that. There were a number of people with no Japanese ancestry in the camps. Most but not all were women who did not want to be separated from their
Right.
children and sometimes from their spouses. I think that one of the reasons why there were more women in that situation than men was because I think it was if a man was not of Japanese descent and could stay on the West Coast and work, then the family would not be financially ruined as everybody else was. So, but yes, there is a lot of documentation. Well, I shouldn't say a lot. There is enough documentation about that that we have a pretty good sense. There were historians estimate that about 2,100 people in mixed race families were incarcerated at one or another time. That doesn't mean that, so those are also people who could have been Japanese but in a mixed race family. It could have been people who were mixed race themselves, so that includes everybody. And then there are just unknown numbers of people stemming from that group who endured some kind of family separation. So, yeah, thanks for the question. Sarah.
So, like, what started you off on writing the story and writing this book?
So two things started me. One was that I was ready to start working on another book when my son went to school. Basically, what counts as full time in like elementary school, but I didn't want to write another memoir. Thankfully, I found a family who's a million times more interesting than mine is. So I think that was a good choice. But also, my husband is Japanese from Japan, and I'm Jewish American. So our son is the first Japanese American person in our entire family, in extended family as well. And so I felt pretty invested in learning more about Japanese American history. I don't know whether Japanese American history will be important to him when he grows up. But in the event that it is, and regardless of also whether or not it becomes interesting to him, or continues to be interesting to him, I wanted to find out more about one of the histories that he was kind of inheriting. And so one day, as like a Jewish American who grew up in a family obsessed with the Holocaust, but with no Holocaust actually direct survivors, no one who was in the camps, in other words, I had this totally neurotic moment where I was like, God, I wonder if there were any Jewish women who were incarcerated in the Japanese American concentration camps. I don't know why I wondered that, but I just did. And so I looked it up, and there was one. So Elaine and her husband were the only Jewish Americans on record in any of the camps for the Japanese Americans. So that's sort of how I first got started, and the more and more I researched the story, the more it just kind of claimed me. And so, yes.
Could you talk some more about the role of the priest and his order in the removal? It sounded like, on the one hand, this was a group of people helping Japanese Americans, and on the other hand, carrying out a rather harmful removal.
Yeah, that's a great question. So the Maryknoll Mission had a long history of doing a lot to help the Japanese American community, and of course I can't read the minds of everyone who was there, but I think it's pretty safe to say that the priests and the nuns who were involved in the forced removal and helping with forced removal were hoping to make the situation easier for the Japanese Americans who were being uprooted and incarcerated. I found I haven't researched a lot into the Maryknoll Mission. There is a lot of research out there, but I found absolutely no evidence that there was any malice. So I think that it was the people who got involved through the Maryknoll Mission were hoping to make the situation easier. There's a really fascinating book that does not look at the Maryknoll Mission, but does look at, quote, complicity in the camps. I think 3 people, I think they might have all been lawyers actually, who were all involved in working in the concentration camps. And it really explores the line between what does it mean when you do something because you want to make a situation better and yet you're participating in it. It's actually written by the child of 2 Holocaust survivors, I believe. His name is Eric Mueller, and he's a lawyer. He's actually a law professor, and I'm now blanking on the name of the book, but it's really, really good. And if you can't find it, you can email me through my website, and I will, in 2 seconds, I can find it in my files, but not in my brain, unfortunately. So that's a great question, and so yes. Hi.
So you referenced kind of the artifacts or what you're reviewing to get the stories, and you refer to a book, for example. I was just wondering how much documentation, where do you find documentation of this kind of history? I mean, it's broad, but there's a very specific, narrow theme that you're following. I was just curious where you started.
That's a great question. So in terms of the Yonedas themselves, there's actually a lot of documentation about them because they were both quite prominent in the leftist and communist. They belonged to the Communist Party in the 1930s, but really through they were very prominent labor and civil rights activists. They were prominent leftists on the West Coast, so they had been sort of media figures is a little too strong. They had been covered a lot by the press. They were arrested for protests and things like that. So they were kind of known to the press, and in the leftist community, they were very well known. So their story up until the time that they went to Manzanar, there's actually quite easy to find that information just with the newspapers.com account. And also there's some labor research archives in San Francisco at one of the San Francisco libraries. San Francisco University with us, San Francisco State, I think, University Library. A fair amount has been written about them and their labor activists, but there was no book length work that was written that focused on their time in Manzanar or their experience as a mixed race family and what their experience as a mixed race family, what it uncovers if you research it about the kind of hidden history of mixed race families in and around the camps. In some ways, their story was unique as a mixed race family because they were activists, and because there was a lot of documentation about them. And in some ways, it wasn't unique. In terms of their experiences in Manzanar, Carl Yoneda published a diary in Japanese, and it was just recently translated by a great, fascinating man named Ian Forsyth. It's called, I think it's just called Manzanar Diary. And that was a huge help to me. He translated it into English, and also became a good friend and helped me a lot. I had questions while I was writing. Elaine also kept a diary that has not been published, but it's actually in Carl's archives, which are weird. So yes, that's the other thing. Because they were labor leaders, they both have archives. Elaine's is in San Francisco and Carl's is in LA. And for some reason, Elaine's diary, which was rich, she didn't speak Japanese at all, actually. So Carl did speak Japanese because his grandparents were Japanese. And he also he was a US citizen, but he went back to Japan for a while as a child. So he spoke Japanese and he wrote in Japanese, but Elaine only wrote in English. She also wrote in Yiddish, but that was not accessible to me. Sorry, Mom. So I was able to get her diary. And then there is an enormous amount of information about the camps themselves. And I think particularly Manzanar, but definitely about all the camps, that you can access the government records. So I was able to know like what the day was like when such and such an event happened. If Elaine mentioned it in her diary, I was able to figure out what else was going on that was actually going on. So the book is totally true, and any time that I say anything about their internal state, it's because they said that. So
Yeah.
Yes.
In school, learning about this time in history, I always heard the camps referred to as internment camps. And I'm wondering, what's the difference? And are they now referred to as concentration camps? Does it mean something different that they're called that?
It's such a good question, and I talk about that a lot in the book. And that's I have an op-ed coming out from the Jewish Book Council. I thought maybe they weren't gonna put the kibosh on it, but they were totally supportive of it. They should be referred to as concentration camps. In my opinion, I very strongly think they should be referred to as concentration camps. They were referred to historically at the time, usually as concentration camps. Certain figures in the army used sort of more euphemisms, like reception center and whatever, but it was not considered explosive to refer to them as concentration camps. The reason I do not refer to them as internment camps is because internment is a legal term for the imprisonment of foreigners during a time of war. And the big myth that I think we still hold on to as a culture about the forced removal and incarceration of the Japanese American West Coast community is that it was an incarceration of foreigners, and that even if there were citizens among them, they were not really citizens because they were Japanese. Like that quote that I read from the LA, I think it was the LA Times. But actually 2/3 of the 120,000 people who were forcibly removed and incarcerated were US citizens. And everybody, there were 6-month-old babies, there were babies born there. There's a picture from the National Archives. It's not in the book, I have it on social media, of a man on a stretcher being loaded through the window of a train. Everybody was incarcerated, was removed and incarcerated. And that's why they should not be referred to, I don't think, as internment camps. And the book also looks at, in a little bit, at the history of, so Elaine and Carl struggled a lot with the term concentration camp and went back and forth about whether or not they were willing to use that term. As historically in their lives, and you can trace also in the media, which I do partly in the book, as the Nazi death camps and extermination camps, as news of those camps broke, people started shying away from using concentration camp. Concentration camp is actually a euphemism that the Nazis used for their camps. They called them special concentration camps. And I have a citation from the media in that too. In fact, their camps were not concentration camps. They were extermination and slave labor camps. But they were trying to hide the truth of that by saying they're just concentration camps. Anyway, I believe that the Nazi camps should not be referred to as concentration camps. They should be referred to as, extermination camps, and that the camps where Japanese Americans were put were concentration camps, and that the problem with using internment is that it repeats that myth that what we were doing was locking up an alien population, which is not what we were doing. So that's a really good question, and it's really, really widely used, internment. So I know people who use it don't mean to be, belittling the history, but I just feel like it's we need to get more comfortable with the term concentration camp for these camps, because that's what they were, if you look at the definition and what the problem is with using internment camp. So thanks for asking. Yes.
In addition to the family considerations that were the timing of the book, which themselves were lovely, I wonder if you consider it fortuitous at all the timing of the publication of the book, not so much the writing, because I heard an echo in that, I think it was the LA Times editorial you quoted from, of it doesn't matter where a fight was born, it's where the exit. I hear that echoes to me today in, Jews in America being held responsible for alleged crimes of the Israeli government.
Yes. Yes.
And we get bricks thrown through our windows because of it.
Yes. So I don't feel fortuitous. You could say fortuitous. I do feel like I feel like it is horrifyingly more current today than I thought it was going to be when I started writing it. I also feel that there's sometimes an expectation that as a Jewish American, that I am necessarily gonna have a comment about what's happening in Israel, in that is similar in some ways, I think, to the expectation that Japanese Americans necessarily had any relation to what was going on in Japan. So I think I understand why as humans, we need to categorize things. There's something just about the way we understand the world. I don't think it's necessarily always bad, but I think it becomes really problematic, and I think that we, at times, and then I think you can see echoes of that today, in many different ways. So, it is something that I've thought a lot about, so, thanks for the question. Yes, and then Sarah.
Did you have an opportunity to interview Elaine and Carl's descendants at all?
I did. I met Tommy's middle daughter. So Elaine and Carl's. So now I'm giving away the end, because obviously.
But they did live.
Well, they had descendants. So yes, they
had
did.
descendants.
I know, I'm trying to be I'm not going to do a spoiler, but unless it's magic.
Well, family members.
Yes,
family
I
members.
did actually. I did, and they were. This granddaughter was really lovely, and at the end of the book, I talk about the legacy of Manzanar for this family and how it rippled through the generations. But I felt super lucky that I found descendants, and that's how actually I became close to the translator of Carl's diary, because he could not find he could not find the family, and so a history organization said to me, do you have any idea how to find the family? I said, yes, I found them. I hacked into, well, it's not hacking, but it kind of sounds like a hack. I looked at the HTML page of something that had the email address to find the email address. It was just submit here, but then I looked and I could actually see her email address, and that's how I found her. So I call it hacking.
It's research.
Yes, exactly. Yeah, so I did, and I felt super lucky about that. Yes, Sarah, and then.
So, I realize this is going to seem like a very ignorant question, I'm aware of. The forced relocation and imprisonment of these Japanese people in the United States, citizens and non-citizens, on the West Coast. So the government forcing people out of their homes to go someplace is horrific. But it was all on the West Coast. Why were none of these people given the opportunity to just move east?
They were, actually.
Oh, they
and
were?
the book talks about that. There was a very short amount of time when the army said it was when the army said if you got to get out of the West Coast, and you can move east if you want, but most people couldn't afford to move
Right,
east, and
right.
the not everybody, not the Onedas, but a lot of the people who lived on the West Coast of Japanese descent had either were in fishing or farming. It was a big farming community. There was a big farming community, and so they couldn't just pick up and move. They didn't have the funds. So there were a small number of people who were able to move. But then the government very quickly, there was many cries in Congress and in the media to just lock these people up in concentration camps. And so the government only allowed people to move for a short amount of time. And then not only were you not allowed to move, but you were not allowed to go outside, a 5-mile radius, because they were getting ready then to incarcerate people. And one of the quotes in the book, and this is an exact quote, but it's a paraphrase, one of the governors of one of the central states said, "The only Japanese I want in my state are either dead or in a concentration camp." So there were a lot of states who weren't willing to take them anyway. So that's why.
I just want to poke in and say we've got time for about one more question before we move on to signings.
Okay. Yes.
This is actually a comment. As a student of history, especially when I study up on other chapters of American history or world history that share a commonality with a series of events such as what you wrote about when you researched, and the personal experience of those who went through unimaginable suffering and to maintain their status as the individuals that they are, the human beings that they are, kind of sewing together the pieces of all these events, whether we're talking about the imprisonment of Japanese Americans, the Holocaust, the Red Scare, the demonization of Muslim people throughout the world and throughout the country, and accusing Jewish people in America of what you talked about, and going all the way back to the 17th century, because I specialize specifically, I don't want to muddy things up, but my specific expertise is in the practice of witch hunting in colonial America and early modern Europe. And I brought something up when I went to this this performance of this historian that was reading part of the sermon notebook of Reverend Samuel Paris last October in Danvers at the Rebecca Nurse Homestead, that all this history, we have to see all this as one great nightmarish epica, this tapestry of this cycle of human volatile darkness that naturally people forget, of the demagoguery and those that were directly affected in all these episodes of world history and American history. And as a result, we have this we as human beings have this unfortunate habit to be still in constant fear of the other in this wilderness called